It's always fun to be introduced in a language that you don't understand. I have no idea what was just said about me. Was it nice? I hope it was nice. Thank you. It's very exciting to be here on my first trip to Helsinki in Finland. I'm going to talk about this book, Everything Bad is Good for You, and the argument that I make in the book about the increased complexity and mental challenge of popular culture in general, and I'm going to focus today, appropriately, on television. I will talk briefly at a couple of points about the gaming culture, because I think it's important in understanding this and helping to understand how television is changing. For those of you who've had a chance to look at the book, I'm actually going to try and give mostly examples that have come out since the book was released about 2 years ago. I guess, yeah, about a year and a half ago. So, because a lot has happened in the past year and a half to, I think, further corroborate the theory. So it's some fresh material that's not actually in the book. I wanted to talk a little bit about the overall argument and tell you just briefly how I came to make this kind of claim that popular culture is, in fact, in some ways making us smarter and not dumbing us down, as people have argued for so long. And it starts really with an insight that I had many years ago, about 6 years ago, when I was on vacation with my wife's family. And she had a nephew at that point who was about 7. His name was Wyatt. And we were on vacation at a beach resort in the States, and it was a rainy day, and so the kids were all kind of inside, kind of crammed in, running around, bouncing off the walls. And I had been playing a video game called SimCity. How many of you are familiar with SimCity? People, yeah, it's a very popular game, best-selling game. One of the great kind of game franchises of all time. For those of you who don't know it, basically it's a game in which you play a kind of a combination of a big urban developer and a city mayor. And so you get to kind of plan the infrastructure for a city, and you can raise and lower taxes, and you develop schools and build police stations and fire departments. And the beauty of the game, though, is that you're not entirely in control of what's going on. So you can build your roads and set up your infrastructure, but if you haven't kind of set up the overall system properly, people won't move in, or you'll have crime rate problems, or you'll have too much pollution. And the art of the game, the intelligence of the game, comes from kind of tweaking all these different variables and exploring the different kind of complexity of the overall system of the city you're trying to build. So I thought it would be fun to sit down with my nephew and show him this game, SimCity, and have a little, kind of waste a little time playing the game together. And so I gave him a kind of a quick tour of the game, which, looking back on it, I think now was kind of a condescending tour, which is basically a tour of the graphics. So I walked him around the screen and I said, "Oh, look, Wyatt, look at that big building there. And look, there's a playground. You see the little kids playing in the playground? Isn't that nice? And there's the mayor's house. That's where I live, Wyatt. Isn't that cool?" And so I showed him all these different things. And at a certain point, I showed him this kind of zone of factories that I had. They were all kind of run down, and some of them had been abandoned, and I had a lot of kind of crime problems in this area. And I said, "Oh, I've been having all this trouble with this area right here with all these factories. You can see some of these buildings are abandoned, and they're kind of overrun, and I just can't get this area to kind of take off." And my nephew kind of looked at the screen, and looked back at me, and looked at the screen again, and then he said, "I think you may need to lower your industrial tax rates." And it was one of those moments where I thought, this kid is 7. And here he is, basically, from just 20 minutes of kind of looking at a game, had figured out this basic relationship between industrial taxation and development. It was basically the kind of thing, if you'd sat him down in a classroom and taught him about kind of urban planning issues, he would be asleep or out the door in 3 seconds. He's 7 years old. But something about what's happening on the screen and the interactive nature of the screen and the kind of possibility for engagement and problem solving was pulling him in. And in a sense, he was learning in spite of himself. He was learning something at a very high level that he didn't even kind of realize was educational in the first place. And I knew that this had been happening in the gaming world, but at the same time, I also knew that there had been an amazing increase in the complexity and challenge of television over the last 20 or 30 years. My wife, at this point, and I were in the process of watching all these great TV shows on DVD, which can be a wonderful way to watch these shows, watching The Sopranos and 6 Feet Under and shows like that. And yet, every time I looked around to see what the kind of official media pundits and commentators were saying about the state of our popular culture, it was lines like this. This is from the American political commentator George Will, who's kind of a conservative commentator. And I could spend the rest of this talk giving you quotes like this. This will be the one representative sample. I'm sure you've seen others like this. And he says, "Ours is an age besotted with graphic entertainments, and in an increasingly infantilized society whose moral philosophy is reducible to a celebration of choice, adults are decreasingly distinguishable from children in their absorption in entertainments and the kinds of entertainments they are absorbed in: video games, computer games, handheld games, movies on their computers, and so on. This is progress, more sophisticated delivery of stupidity." That was the kind of conventional wisdom. And in the States, I sometimes say the debate about popular culture when I sat down to write this book was between two camps. One camp thought the popular culture was so bad that it was destroying American society, and the other camp just thought it was really, really bad. Those were the two sides of the debate. And so what I wanted to focus on was not the question of values, not the question of violence, not the question of sexual content and obscenity, which was generally how the media would debate these things when they talked about culture, but rather the question of how much mental work do you have to do to make sense of, say, your average television show, or to play a video game all the way through to the end, or to participate in an online forum on the internet. What are the trends over the last 30 years in terms of that kind of cognitive workout, the amount of kind of thinking and problem solving you have to do, how many plot lines you have to follow on a television show, how many characters and interrelationships you have to keep track of. And if you look at the history of popular culture over the last 30 years along that lines, not in terms of violence, but in terms of cognitive engagement, what you end up finding is that there's a very distinct upward trend towards more complexity and more mental challenge in the popular culture, not what we usually think, which is that it's a decline. And so in the book, I call this the sleeper curve, because every time I told people about this theory, they would say, "Oh, it reminds me of that Woody Allen film from the early 70s, a classic early Woody Allen comedy called Sleeper, where he wakes up he plays this health food store operator who wakes up 200 years in the future, and basically all the foods that were supposed to be terrible for you, science has discovered are fantastic. And so all the scientists are saying, "Oh, you must eat cheeseburgers and milkshakes. Go ahead, go do it. And quick, smoke this cigarette. It'll make you feel much better." And so people said, "Oh, this theory of pop culture actually being kind of nutritious in this way, it reminds me of Sleeper." And so I call this trend towards more complexity the sleeper curve. So I want to look in detail at two parts of the sleeper curve, two key trends here. And they both involve an increase in engagement and kind of cognitive work. One involves an increase in kind of formal complexity, and the other involves an increase in participation. So I want to walk through a bunch of examples of this and talk about really what it all means. So let's start with complexity. Now, I said I want to talk mostly about television, of course, but I want to just give you one example from the game world to give you a sense of what's happening in that part of the universe, because I think increasingly when we think about the generation that's now in their teens or early 20s, particularly among males, gaming is a key part of their kind of cultural identity, and in some ways it sets a tone for the other kinds of media experiences that they have, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit with respect to television. So since the book came out, actually, a few months after it came out, there was a release of a game called Civilization 4. Now, how many people have heard of Civilization 4? This is a little less than SimCity. Civilization 4 is also it's part of a franchise called Civilization. This for a while was the number 2 PC game in the States. So this is not a kind of a marginal art house experimental game. This is a big best-selling hit game that 12-year-olds are playing. And what you do in Civilization is that you recreate the economic, technological, and social history of the entire world. So basically, you're sitting there and trying to figure out what would happen if history had developed in this way. We developed an early representative democracy and industrialized at an earlier rate. What would happen if we, kind of developed a different kind of society and went this way in the world? So basically, you're recreating world history.